A wealthy man disguises himself as a limo driver to uncover his young wife's secret afternoon activities, only to be shocked by what he finds. When Edward Montpelier was 18, he planned to marry Rachel Harrington. Rachel was funny, beautiful, and lively, and she felt the same way about Edward. Their families were friends and everyone was excited about their marriage. They seemed perfect for each other, and a happy ending seemed certain. But 3 days before the wedding, Rachel and her 3 friends went to Las Vegas for a girls' trip. On their way back, a truck's brakes failed, and 4 families were devastated. For the first year, Edward was in shock, hoping it was all just a bad dream. He expected Rachel to come back, and everything would go back to normal. But that didn't happen. Edward had to accept that his beautiful bride was gone at just 23 and figure out how to rebuild his life from the wreckage of his dreams. Edward's parents were unsure how to help him. His father suggested he come work with him to distract himself and focus on the family business. So Edward dedicated himself to his father's chain of gas stations, and his single-minded drive quickly pushed the already successful business to the top. The only problem was that 10 years later, Edward was still alone. His father worried, especially after he became ill, and Edward took over the running of the company in its entirety. "Look, I wanted him to take his mind off his grief," his father said to his mother, "not to live for nothing but business." They encouraged him to date and even introduced him to the lovely and eligible daughters of their wealthy friends, but Edward didn't seem to find any of the ladies attractive. Then Edward decided to do a spot check on some of their more remote gas stations. Just pop in as a customer and see how the individual service outlets treated their customers. On his way back after a week of visiting the more remote regions of the Midwest, just a few miles from home, Edward had a flat tire, and when he went to look in the trunk, there was no spare. There was also no cell service, so Edward locked the car and started walking, hoping he'd get to a service station soon. After an hour's walk, he spotted a ramshackle old gas station. Finally, he'd get help. He walked into the dusty store and approached the counter. "Excuse me," he said, "I had a flat and I don't have a spare." The person behind the counter was wearing an oil-smeared mechanic's overalls and a baseball cap. But when she turned around, Edward saw that it was a beautiful girl. He started stammering and blushing, but the girl, her name was Rebecca, thought he was sweet and funny. She took him out to his car in her truck and insisted on changing his tire. Edward was in love. In a moment, his years of solitude and pain were washed away. He wanted Rebecca, and nothing would stand in his way. His mother was shocked when he told them she was a car mechanic, but his father actually thought it was funny. What Edward's father didn't like was the fact that Rebecca was poor and had no family, no background. "She's not our kind of people, Edward," his dad said. "What kind of people is that, Dad?" Edward asked sharply. "Do we only consider the rich our kind of people?" "No," said Edward's dad. "Of course not, but you know nothing about this girl, where she comes from. She's too young for you, and she might be after your money." "Come on, Dad," Edward said. "She's a sweet, kind girl, and for the first time since Rachel passed away, I feel alive." After that, Edward's parents didn't say another word against the wedding. Rebecca and Edward were married with great pomp at Edward's parents' huge country house in Martha's Vineyard, and the wedding was attended by hundreds of guests. But they were all on the groom's side. It seemed that Rebecca had neither family nor close friends. Even her bridesmaids were Edward's sisters. "She's hiding something," Edward's mother told her son. "No one is that alone in the world. No one." But Edward wouldn't hear a word against Rebecca. He loved her, and he accepted her for who and what she was. The couple moved into a lovely new house, and Rebecca quickly got used to Edward's way of life, which included a housekeeper, 2 maids, and a driver. The couple had been married for 2 years when Edward's driver, who had been working for the family for many years, dropped a wrench in the works. He showed up at Edward's door, twisting his cap between his hands. "Sir," he said awkwardly, "I wanted to talk to you about something." "Well, out with it, Pharaoh," Edward said. "What is it? Do you want a raise?" The man flushed and shook his head. "No, sir. It's about Mrs. Montpelier, sir." "What about my wife?" asked Edward, puzzled. "Well, sir, over the last 6 months, she's been acting odd," Pharaoh said. "Every afternoon she says she wants to go shopping, but she has me drop her off at a very bad part of town. Then she calls me 2 hours later to pick her up, and she never has any shopping, sir." "I see," said Edward. "I wouldn't have said anything, sir," Pharaoh said. "But I've known you all my life, sir, since you were a little boy." "Well, Pharaoh, maybe you can help me solve this mystery," Edward said. "Tomorrow, you will tell Mrs. Montpelier that your nephew will be driving her because you have a doctor's appointment. I'll wear your uniform, your cap, and dark glasses, and I'll keep the smoke divider in the limousine up," Edward said. "She won't even look at me, and I'll find out the truth." That night, Edward casually asked Rebecca what she was doing the next day, and she replied, "Oh, nothing much. Just going into town for some shopping, maybe get my hair done." But Edward knew it was all a lie. That night, lying in bed next to his beautiful wife, he couldn't sleep. Was his entire marriage a lie? He'd been so happy these last 2 years, and he thought Rebecca was too. He thought, "Tomorrow, I'll know the whole truth." The next day, Edward pretended to leave for the office, then ducked back into Pharaoh's apartment over the garage and changed into his uniform. He slicked back his hair with gel, put on his dark glasses, and got into the car to wait for Rebecca. At the arranged time, Rebecca came out, got into the car, and said, "Please, can you drive me to 25 Camden Street?" Edward nodded and drove. The address Rebecca had asked to be taken to was very unsavory, in a part of town where the apartments were cheap and often occupied by people just one step away from living on the streets. When they arrived at the address, Rebecca instructed him to wait for her phone call before picking her up. Not once had she looked at Edward. She really seemed preoccupied. Edward drove down 2 blocks and parked the limousine. Then he walked back and into the building Rebecca had entered. It was a dump. What was his wife doing here? Then Edward heard her voice. "I'm sorry I can't stay too long, but you know I do love you." A red-hot wave of jealousy and anger ran through Edward, and without a second thought, he shoved his shoulder into the door. Inside, the apartment was even more miserable, and sitting on the sofa holding an old man's hands was Rebecca. She jumped to her feet, deadly pale. "Edward," she gasped. "What are you doing here?" "I should be the one asking the questions," Edward cried. "What is this place, and who is this man?" Rebecca took a deep breath. "This is my father, Edward. He is ill. He had a stroke, so I come to help him whenever I can." "But why didn't you tell me?" "You said you were an orphan," Edward asked. Rebecca whispered, "I was so embarrassed because my father was in prison. I thought you wouldn't want to be with me, a girl from nowhere with a convict father." Edward took her hands and said, "I love you, Rebecca, and nothing will change that." Rebecca started crying and hugged him. "Oh, Edward, I'm so sorry for lying," she said. She then introduced him to her father, who had suffered a stroke and could no longer speak. Edward arranged for her father to move into a care facility where he would get proper help, so Rebecca wouldn't have to sneak in to see him. A few weeks later, Rebecca shared exciting news with Edward. He was going to be a father.